Hi, everyone, and welcome to this conversation about governing Power BI. My name is Melissa Coates, and I'm self-employed, and I'm a little bit different from most Power BI people. Rather than being a specialist in development, I focus more on the governance and administration type of topics in the world of Power BI. And I spend most of my time these days on two main things. One is some technical writing for Microsoft, and we're going to talk a little bit in a moment about one of those things called the Power BI Adoption Roadmap. So we'll revisit that here in a second. There's also something that you might be familiar with called the Planning a Power BI Enterprise Deployment White Paper, which is getting a little old now, almost 2 years old. And so if that's something that you have used in the past, we are currently updating it right now, and you'll start to see updates added to it in little bits over the course of the next few months. The first piece is going to land in about a week. So I'll announce it on my blog, and you will also be able to see it on social media, if you follow Twitter and that sort of thing. So let me pop one thing into the chat. If you would like a copy of the slides from tonight's presentation, that's where you can find them. The second thing I spend most of my time on is an online course called Power BI Deployment Governance. And if you grab the slides, you can find information about that if you're interested in a deeper dive into what we're going to cover tonight. So tonight, with the hour that we have, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the different topics that I'm showing you here on the screen right now. As you can imagine, this is a massive, massive topic. So we're really just going to dip our toes in and share some ideas for things that you want to spend some time on in this area. And as I'm talking to you, I'm making a few assumptions that you've got Power BI, and even if you might not have formal quote unquote governance happening, you're absolutely experiencing some successes, because that can happen. And that's very, very common. We usually refer to that as viral adoption. And so that also means that you're familiar with basics of deploying content. We're not actually covering technical basics here tonight. This is more of a theoretical and a high level, almost strategic in a lot of ways, discussion about supporting the people that do the development. But even if you've got some successes, there are always ways that you can improve how you oversee Power BI. So let me start with the Power BI adoption roadmap. And even though you might say, well, I thought this was a governance session, adoption is very, very relevant. And let me explain. This thing called the Power BI adoption roadmap, and let me drop the link in the chat if you are not familiar with it, is something that we published a few months ago. And we can think of it as this series of strategic and tactical things that you want to think about to lead to a successful Power BI adoption effort. And so, as it's shown here on the right, we oriented it in 10 main areas, and the sequencing is definitely not a perfect thing. But the idea is you understand your data culture first, and you have executive support, and you understand how your content's owned and managed and delivered. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in tonight's session as well, before you start implementing things like a center of excellence and your governance initiatives. We put a huge emphasis on driving and supporting your internal community. And last but not least is this little bitty thing called system oversight, also known as system administration. And it's not last because it's the least important, and it's not last because you physically do the thing last. In fact, there's a few pieces of that that you would do very, very early, but it's that everything else informs how you make governance decisions and how you conduct your system oversight. And we went ahead and gave it a focus of what we call organizational adoption. So that means I need to explain briefly what I mean by these three types of adoption, because a lot of times you just hear the term user adoption and it's used very, very generically. So how we are defining these terms is we're calling organizational adoption this thing that is really all about governing and managing your environment well that can support and enable your BI efforts. And user adoption is absolutely about using the system, because a lot of times people just equate adoption with we're using the system more and more, but it's absolutely more than usage alone. And so what we want with user adoption is that people are continually learning and getting better so that they're using Power BI in an effective way. And then the final piece, which is very, very important, is this idea of solution adoption. So this set of reports, for instance, that you spent so many hours creating, well, does it have actual impact and actual business value? As you can imagine, they're all super related to each other. And as you have more mature organizational adoption practices, things around user adoption and solution adoption are absolutely easier, and they turn around and be more mature as well. So you already heard me say this, that adoption is more than just usage. It's not just using the technology, but can we be effective with it? And that's way, way harder to measure than how many report renders do we have this quarter versus last quarter, or how many active users do we have this year versus last year. But think about it this way. If we have tons and tons and tons of duplicate data models that have lots of redundant data, lots of effort to maintain those, and then they're inconsistent. The fact that there's more data does not necessarily always mean that that's a good thing. Or maybe we're saying, yeah, we produced a bunch of reports, but all anybody's doing is a lot of downloads and a lot of exports. They're not using the system in the way in which it was intended. And that's the kind of thing that we really start driving with thinking about all of these things in the Power BI adoption roadmap. So we're going to conclude each section with a couple of suggested actions. So if you're not familiar with it, one thing I would suggest is to just review this roadmap end to end, just to kind of get familiar with the concepts, the considerations, and really start to think about for each of the areas what your current state is. And by that, I mean the good, the bad, and the ugly. And just kind of at this point, gather that information so that you know where you are currently. That brings us to the next piece of things that we did in the Power BI adoption roadmap, which is incorporate this idea of maturity levels. And so we used 5 levels. They're starting at the bottom, 100 through 500. And we used the same levels as the Power Cat adoption maturity model and Microsoft 365's maturity model. So we did not make these up. And the idea here is if you're thinking about improving governance and improving any of those areas of organizational adoption, it's really helpful to know where are you at now and where do you really want to be. So very, very briefly, if we start at the bottom, level 100, that's our starting point. And either things are brand new or they're just informally handled. And good things can happen. The problem with this is that they're just reliant on judgment and experience of individual people. And we've probably all experienced that, that some people in certain business units have great practices and they do great things. And then other people have just more chaos and um, things that are just much less disciplined. So here, good things can be happening. It's just not going to be consistent and it's probably undocumented. So as we move up to level 200, here we're starting to make a purposeful effort to standardize, improve, and document our practices. And one of the favorite things I like to tell people is if you have good things already happening, try to take that from some individual group down in, accounting, for instance, and can we start actually scaling that out? So here at level 200, we've started to do that. It's just not necessarily happening uniformly across the organization yet. And granted, it may never happen completely uniformly. By the time we get to level 300, we have an approved governance plan, we have focus, we have objectives, we are trying to be consistent across the organization with our guidelines and our policies. And things like roles and responsibilities, we've documented them. We are understanding what we expect of people. By the time we get to level 400, we're trying to take the things that we learn and continually get better and scale those learnings throughout the org. We know where Power BI fits in our overall BI strategy, and things are really just starting to work on all cylinders related to adoption, data culture, governance, and all that stuff. And by the time we're up to 500, we've gotten really good at making sure that what we're doing from a Power BI governance perspective aligns with business objectives, right? We don't just have an administrator that's making up rules because they think it's a good idea and flipping tenant settings to whatever it is they think is relevant. We have actual focus and objectives. We have measurable goals, measurable KPIs. We are continually tracking and making good progress. And automation is often a priority here too, so that we can get to that idea of continuous improvement. So all this is well and good and something to focus on. But here's where it gets really, really tricky. We're going to have different maturity levels depending on what lens we take. So let's say you go through and you do an assessment and you say we are at a level 300 for the organization as a whole. Here's the thing, you're going to have, especially if you have a lot of self-service BI activity that's happening throughout the organization. The more autonomy all of those people have, that means there's going to be different practices. So that means different business units or your different large departments are absolutely going to be at different levels from the organization as a whole. And here's the thing, that's okay. We don't necessarily have to make everybody across the organization do things the exact same way. And then we've got the idea of the different capabilities. So for instance, if you're in a really regulated industry, you might say, yes, our governance capabilities need to get to level 400 or level 500. But maybe if you're in I'm going to pick on retail. If you're in retail, for instance, maybe you aren't quite as worried about that, and perhaps you've got a ton of analysts that need to move fast. So you need to put a lot of effort on user support. You might be seeking a really high level there, whereas some other organization might say, user support, we're more centralized, so we'll put less investments there. So my point in all of this is that your variances in maturity levels can be really purposeful based on where you've chosen to devote your resources, or it could be just accidental because it's something you've never paid attention to before. So your action for this is really to start thinking about what your existing maturity level is. And over in the roadmap, every article ends with a few pieces of information of if you're at level 200 for this particular topic, you might have such and such characteristics. Here's the thing. They're very generic as written. Think of them as inspiration. So what you really want to do is say, well, what does success look like for you? What does the next level look like? And what does the level after that look like? And that's what I mean when I say here, customize those maturity levels. So think about what your goal should be, and you don't have to shoot for a 500 on everything. There are certain things that might be really important, and other things where level 2 to 400 might be just fine because we all don't have nearly enough time, money, people, etc. So that brings us to priorities. And here's kind of a fun exercise. One way you can think about prioritizing your projects, your people, your time, your money. If you had $100 to spend, how would you allocate it? So if you start having discussions about what's important, and we start with something like data protection and security, well, of course, everybody's going to say that's important. And well, so is data trustworthiness. And then we get into some of these other items that may or may not be more or less of a pain point depending on your actual situation. So if you said, well, $50 of my $100 is on data protection, well, that helps you drive 50% of your effort and helps you prioritize and allocate who's going to do what by what date or timeline and so forth. So just trying to help you figure out what's really important. Here's the other thing to think about is where you're at now, where does governance come in? And feel free to toss a message in the chat with where you're at now if you feel like sharing. But situation number one here is we have rolled out Power BI, and at some point in the future, we have to start introducing governance. And that's the most painful because we are going to have to ask people to change what they are doing. But we've gotten a lot of value out of Power BI, and it's grown, which means we've gotten to the point where we say, oh, we have to bring some order to the chaos, so to speak. So then there's the complete opposite, which is the kind of organization that says we need to plan out everything before we open the door at all. And the trouble with that is that I've worked with a couple of organizations that have done this, that want to go through like a 6-month effort before giving out any licenses and letting anybody use the tool at all. So as you can imagine, the ideal situation is this iterative one, within reason, of course. If we constantly are changing what we want people to do and changing our minds, that is annoying to our user community. But this idea of iteratively improving over time is kind of the ideal one. And if I were to redo this one again, I'd probably make this one at the beginning just a little bit bigger, just not necessarily this huge effort. So what that means is we think about this idea of having two paths. While we're building out this governance groundwork, we're also basically just getting things done. And if we can make the two then work in tandem while we learn, that is a really good thing just from the perspective of we're giving people enough of an ability to get things done without completely getting in their way. So if you know what's important, that little exercise we did with the $100, and you can of course always change the things that you're allocating money on, then you basically just go through a traditional prioritization effort to where we say, well, here's the immediate things that we absolutely have to do right away, short, medium, longer term kind of things, and just make incremental progress because governance is never done, ever. If at some point you have any questions, toss them in the chat. I have it over here, and I know Renata will help me with that as well. So feel free to pipe up in the chat if there's something that you would like to check on. So based on what I've said so far, you might already have a hint about this, but one of my core beliefs is that governance can absolutely improve the user experience if we approach it from this mentality of what I refer to as user empowerment, more so than command and control, if that makes sense. With a good plan for governance, we can save our users from so many headaches. So that's why we really want to think about it from this aspect of user enablement. So the way that I tend to approach it is that we have three main goals for governing self-service BI. First, this idea of user enablement. And again, that's because we are saying this is self-service BI. The idea is to give people what they need to be productive and efficient and work with data within the guardrails that we need to give them, which is what brings us to 2 and 3. Do we have some internal requirements of some sort? Do we have regulations of whatever variety that we need to comply with? So if we backtrack for a second, there's a whole bunch of definitions out there about what the heck is governance, because I just gave you three aspects. But let's backtrack a second to just a little bit more of a textbook definition. And we're saying that it's this system of decision rights and accountabilities. So who can do what, actions with what information, when, under what circumstances, and using what methods. So governance is this really ambiguous word. And when you're talking to somebody about it in your org, depending on the context, this term governance might refer to a group or a team in the org. It might refer to specific policies, standards, business rules, etc. It might refer to specific responsibilities. It might even refer to auditing or how they go about enforcement. So for this reason, at least one of you is going to chuckle. Governance is often thought of as kind of a dirty word because it's so often approached from this perspective of, nope, this is what you cannot do. So in that case, if you're trying to introduce more of this in your org, sometimes I hear the term data utility. Sometimes I hear things like a data advocacy program. If you need to rename it to something else to get things done and not encounter, political challenges, absolutely do it. If that works, do it. And then the other thing that I want to point out before we move on is that although we call it data governance, we're not usually focusing specifically on the data itself. Usually what we're focusing on is what are people doing with the data? Or put another way, the true focus is on governing people's behavior so that our organizational data is well managed. So back to that whole organizational adoption thing we talked about at the beginning. The other thing that gets confusing and starts to mean different things to different people is, where does governance start and stop? And where do all of these other things that surround it start and stop? So depending on your role and how you do things in your organization, you might actually pull in certain things into the umbrella of governance. So just kind of make sure you're talking the same language. The one big thing that I do want to point out here is that the way I think about it is that governance is the policies, the processes, the guidance you give people to make sure that we're using data well. And then the administration is the day-to-day activities that would enact governance policies and basically support the systems that we're using, the systems that are, effectively being governed. So I mention that because a lot of times I hear people say governance and administration interchangeably, and I think that they are two fundamentally very different things. But again, as long as in your org, the people that you're talking to know what you mean and you're all speaking the same language, that's what's most important. So at this point, what you really want to do is figure out what's your view of the world. What are the most important things that you need to start promoting to encourage that balance of those three things: the user enablement, complying with any internal requirements, and regulations, which are usually externally imposed. So that all brings us to data culture. When we're thinking about what actions to take, your data culture matters, and it matters a whole lot. And any presentation that mentions data culture in the world of Power BI would not be complete if I didn't mention Matthew Roche. Matthew's actually who I work with at Microsoft on the Power BI adoption roadmap. He's also who I'm working with on the enterprise deployment white paper updates. And this is a definition that he has on his website, that a data culture promotes and encourages data-driven decisions by more stakeholders in more parts of the organization. So he's got a whole series on his website about considerations for a healthy data culture. So if you're into that kind of thing, I encourage you to go to ssbipolar.com. Now we can talk about a whole bunch of stuff with regard to data culture, but simply put, there's kind of three big things that I tend to put under the umbrella of data culture. Data discovery. The simplest definition we can give it is we can find the data. Data literacy. We can understand the data. And data democratization means we can use the data, meaning we do not reserve the ability to access and use data to just the coveted few. Data democratization says within the requisite guardrails, we will make data readily available within our organization. All three of these really are focused on promoting usage of the data, which is a good thing because the more we use our data, the more data-driven we become, which sounds really obvious. But here's the thing, when we're talking about governance, there is this natural struggle between protecting the data, that saying no mentality, that controlling and limiting mentality. There's that natural struggle between it and promoting use of the data. So here's what I ask of you, is that when you are making decisions, try to make promoting the ability to use the data to be just as much of a priority as protecting and limiting it. That's data democratization, and that's a healthy data culture. And if this kind of idea is something that sounds appealing and you want to read more about it, there's a book called Disrupting Data Governance by Laura Madsen. It was published in the last couple years. It's fairly new, and it's not the least bit boring. It's very a fun read if there ever was a data governance book that was fun. So if you're interested in this kind of thinking, that would be a really good one to grab. So with our data culture, what do we want to do? We want to increase our reliance on data. And we want to be able to use data by more stakeholders, the definition I stole from Matthew. Well, we want to do so with methods and best practices endorsed by our Center of Excellence. And we haven't talked about that yet. In the Power BI Adoption Roadmap, we talk about the Center of Excellence as being this group of people in the organization that helps us get things done in a good way. It's a centralized group usually. It doesn't have to be. There's a bunch of different ways we can structure it, but regardless of how the group is formed, the group has visibility into what's going on across all of the organizational boundaries, which is highly important if we want to try to standardize and or scale out good practices. So I don't actually care if you have a group on the org chart that's called the Center of Excellence. What I care about is that the kinds of things that the COE or the Center of Excellence would do is being done by some team in your org. Our next goal is we want to use trusted data, right? We don't want trash data flying around. And we want this idea of continually adapting and learning to be something that's just common. And it's really easy to say, and then it's hard to do because when we screw up and we send out bad reports and the CFO freaks out, nobody has fun with any of that. So in the comments, I see one that says, the Power BI service is really scaring my organization. They're stuck on the idea that protecting the data means disabling all options in the Power BI administration portal. And that's a tough one to overcome because it's a natural thing to say, oh, too many exports, we better just turn off exports. And that's just one example. But the thing that I usually try to encourage in situations like that is we've got the Power BI activity log. So you've got all of the activities that are occurring in the service being logged. So instead of, if we continue to use the export example, instead of just turning it off for everybody, what if you have somebody that's actually paying attention to what's happening in that Power BI activity log and you see somebody that is doing lots and lots of exports, for instance. Then you go and you talk to them and figure out what is it that they need to do that is causing this piece. And in all likelihood, you know, they're pulling data from one thing and probably doing something manual and getting it elsewhere, and it can probably be streamlined. People don't always want to give up their practices, even if they're not good ones, but it's a tough thing if the natural inclination is to turn everything off. So yeah, let me let my subconscious think on that a little bit as we continue on. So our goals that we just talked about were to increase those handful of things. So the other things that we're trying to reduce is this reliance on undocumented or tribal knowledge. If Joe is the only person who knows how to do this one thing, that's risk for the organization if Joe transfers, retires, etc. We also want this idea of being data-driven means, oh, we're going to rely less, at least less, on hunches and opinions and guts. It's still there. It will always be there. We're humans, but data-informed decisions makes for a more mature organization, and you can't make data-informed decisions unless we're actually using the data. This idea of pro mentalities, and what I mean by this is that one person that is so important that they've got to do this thing. But turns out, although they are great, they are highly proficient, they are a bottleneck. And they might be so terribly busy that then they start to create substandard work. And they know what shortcuts they took, but it might not be scalable or maintainable because they're so overworked. So we want to reduce over reliance on those sorts of behaviors by training and supporting more people to work with data directly. And then reduce the overly rigid governance approaches. So at this point, kind of just make sure you know what's really going on. And as you're working on a prioritized list of actions, what can you really realistically accomplish? Now, we talked about goals and priorities. So we know that we need to make sure we understand what's actually happening today. And that's our current state. So when we think about, we know we need to change something. Well, what do we do to think about what to change? So I have 4 factors to give you. And those 4 factors are associated with the data and the reports, who owns and manages the content. And I'm going to talk about each one of these just a little bit more here in a moment. What's the scope of the content delivery? What's the subject area? And what's the importance or the criticality level of that data or the data being displayed on reports? One or the other. And the combination of all of that really drives these decisions that we make. So let's talk about the first one, this idea of who owns and manages the content. The first one, actually, let me start on the rows. We have 2 rows. We have who owns and manages the data and who owns and manages the reports. And in most organizations, fewer people work on data sets and data flows, and a lot more people create reports from those data sets and data flows. If we go for the columns, we've got business-led self-service BI. And in that situation, some sort of decentralized group owns and manages both the data and the reports. All right, so on the flip side, on the right, we have enterprise BI. And an enterprise team or a centralized team of some variety, might be the BI team, might be IT, whomever, I don't care. It's centrally being managed. So on the far left, that usually means we have more flexibility and less oversight. And on the far right, we have less flexibility because it's enterprise content and more oversight. So where it gets really interesting is what we tend to call managed self-service BI. And a lot of times we talk about it to where some sort of centralized team is going to manage the data. And this is kind of hard to see here on this, but a decentralized team manages the reports. And here's the thing. This pattern can work even if it's not really centralized versus decentralized in a pure way. That's just usually the way we talk about it. But the benefit of this is that we are managing and maintaining the data less times. And Microsoft refers to this as discipline at the core and flexibility at the edge. So this is a really important part of the equation, and you have to absolutely understand how each team is doing things. And by the way, a single team can be doing all 3, and that's totally okay. So it might almost be on a solution by solution basis that you have to think about this kind of thing. But who is actually owning and managing the content is not the whole story. We have to marry that up with what we call the scope of content delivery. So if we think about it, something that's personal, not going to heavily govern that. Something that is being delivered to the entire enterprise should be more tightly governed and managed. And then where it gets trickier is something in the middle. So When these align in expected ways, things are easier to manage. So let's say we've got business-led self-service BI and it's being deployed just to a team. No problem. The enterprise BI team or the COE, it produces content for, these types of things. No problem. Those are expected matches. Where things get a lot trickier is when a team, a small team, wants to deliver content widely to the enterprise. Things like that, almost a mismatch in the expected, the way it would line up is where it gets harder to govern. Now, I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm just saying that that's where we have to make it clear, how are you allowed to do this and what's required if you're allowed to do this. So those are the first two really, really big ones. Each one of those has its own article in the Power BI Adoption Roadmap. Then the third one is really just comes down to all data isn't created equal. So we wouldn't ever govern all data exactly the same. We would focus more on, is this data sensitive? Is it subject to certain regulations? Is it particularly confidential? That sort of thing. And then the fourth one is kind of related to number three, but a little different. This is more about trying to find our critical data elements. So is this particular data very critical for making a timely decision or vital to business operations? Is it on the dashboard that all the managers see every single day, right? That kind of stuff when we're talking about a criticality level of data. So those are the four things. You might come up with a slightly different group of four things, but try to come up with what your criteria is for defining governance policies so that you can put your effort where the effort really needs to be. And then you also want to think about which groups can and should manage their own content. And by that, I mean, the big departments that have their own data analysts and so forth that can absolutely take on that from a self-service BI perspective. But what exactly does that look like? What are the guardrails that we need to give them? And what kind of monitoring might we do from the organizational perspective when that's happening? All right, supporting the internal community. Lots and lots and lots of things here. One of the absolute biggest success factors is giving people what they need. Just handing them a Power BI license and saying, go figure it out with blogs and YouTube videos is a recipe for having a wide amount of chaos. We really need to support and train people. So I'm of the belief that one of the best ways we can decrease risk, and I mean decrease risk to the organization by improperly managing data because we just didn't know any better, is to help people achieve that knowledge. So along that lines, we talked briefly a bit before about the center of excellence, and you may or may not physically have this group, but who is going to nurture your internal community of users? And who's going to mentor them, the champions and the experts? And a lot of times in the Power BI world, we talk about this idea of champions. And that's just putting a name to something that happens every day. If you think about when you're working in a team of people, there's usually one or two people that have decided they love this stuff and they have figured out how to do things. So guess what? Their coworkers come to them for help. So they almost do first line support. So that model can work really, really well, especially if we, from the COE perspective, help support that champions level so they can turn around and support the rest of the users in their team. Now, they have to have time to do it. It has to be a priority. If it's just tacked on to their regular job, that's a whole nother thing. who's defining and managing the governance model? So the guardrails that we need to operate into, and who has this idea of a cross-departmental view into what's happening? Because if nobody has one, that means there's going to be lots of inconsistencies, and that may or may not be a problem. So you want to set up what we call the Power BI Hub. This could just be a SharePoint site, but try to design it so that it's in a user-friendly, logical way with the documentation that people need, links, resources, training, etc. We could talk for the whole hour about just this one thing, so I'm going to resist the urge. But whichever technology that you use, that's a really good thing for people to start uh, getting in the habit of using that as their home base for finding information, which takes time. And then make sure you have a strong user support model. In the adoption roadmap, we talk about, I believe it's 6 levels, and they get less formal to more formal. And then office hours is something else that we talk about in the roadmap, just an informal thing, usually once or twice a week. People can bring their questions, and depending on how you conduct it, others can kind of watch and learn, others can participate and help answer. There's different formats, but this sort of thing, in addition to formal support, is really important. All right, roles and responsibilities. This is really just all about, if we have guardrails, and we should, what is expected of them? How does everybody know how much flexibility they do or don't have? So when we're starting to think about roles and responsibilities, or really accountability, we think about it from 3 levels. So the bottom level is operational. These are the people in your business units. These are your self-service authors, creators, users, etc. And then we've got the tactical level in the middle. So these are groups that span business units. And then we've got the executive level at the top. So the largest number of people are at this operational level at the bottom. And in a self-service BI world, they have a lot of power. And that means they really are the foundation of our well-governed system. And so levels 2 and 3 there, they have more authority across the organization, and they're empowered to make decisions that affect the operational layer. So I'm basically going to repeat this because it's important enough. Those people in that operational level, our content owners, our subject matter experts, the people that create and use the content, they are the foundation of our well-governed system. So a good place to start with this is, who's our executive sponsor? And if we need to enact some policies that need to be implemented across the organization, especially across organizational boundaries, we're all familiar with everybody and their little fiefdoms. How much authority does this person have? So if your executive sponsor is somebody that's loves Power BI, but is in one business unit, they can get a lot of stuff done, but they may or may not have that organizational authority that they need. Define roles, responsibilities when you need to. This is not always necessary, but you might include some responsibilities within formal HR job descriptions whenever that becomes relevant to do so. I propose that it is incredibly important to be transparent with users about the decisions that have made. So if we go back to Renaud's comment in the chat about disabling options in the Power BI Admin Center, people are going to read things online that I should be able to do this or that and not know why it doesn't work. And some people will file a ticket or ask somebody, and others will just sigh and move on and keep doing the old inefficient thing that we don't necessarily want them to do because there's a better way. So what we want to avoid is this idea of a Power BI administrator deciding on their own what should and should not be allowed. In small teams, maybe that's fine. Maybe they absolutely understand uh, the needs of their business. But I'm proposing that it should be a little bit more formalized than that. So I am proposing that what you do is you go through and you review every tenant setting. And is this set to either encourage a behavior that you want people to do or discourage or deny things that you do not want people to do, and why that decision is made? So once you have done that, I want you to actually document those settings for your internal community. So back to that hub with some documentation. This is one of them, including if the example I like to use is push apps to end users. That's one that, yeah, we probably don't have to allow everybody in the entire organization to do that. Maybe we do, but if we limit it in our documentation here, we would explain this is disabled. The reason why is because we don't want new apps to pop up on everybody's menus all the time. So we have elected to, include one or two people from every business unit, whatever. But here's the group that you have to ask for to be able to do this thing in the tenant settings. So because there's no read-only viewer role to go and view the tenant settings, that's why we like having this documentation, just to circumvent people just being irritated that something does not work. And think about who's allowed to be your Power BI administrator, because they can go in and change any of these things at any point in time. If you have more than a handful, that is too many. 2 to 4 is usually kind of that perfect number. 1 is too few. 2 to 4 is a really good number. All right, I think this is our last section, if I'm not mistaken, and that's really the need to use data for our adoption monitoring and for auditing. And this is all really important data. So lots of things that we can do with this data, and most of it we would get from the activity log. Again, another topic we could spend the whole hour on just it. But where's our critical content? And if we know that we have some critical content, are we supporting it adequately? So for instance, if a data refresh isn't reliable, or what if a report shared from someone's My Workspace suddenly gets hundreds of views per day? It doesn't belong there. Change tracking. This includes, I might need to know when actual content changed. I might also need to know when security changes occurred. Satisfying requests from auditors. Very, very important. Monitoring our adoption efforts. So usage is a big part of adoption. It's not the only part. We talked about that way at the beginning. So figuring out if the system's being used the way that we would like it to be used. Data trustworthiness levels, the second one here. So we talked about that middle of the three management modes of reusing data across lots and lots of reports. So how many of our data sets support more than one report? How many certified data sets are there that are supporting a lot of reports versus non-certified data sets? All those sorts of things that you can start figuring out from a data perspective. How trustworthy is the data that we are producing? And by the way, this one only is meaningful if we actually have a list of things that certified content means this and this and this and this and this have occurred. Has to be meaningful and has to be consistent. License usage, especially if you're short on buying licenses and you have to be careful, we can figure out that sort of information. Usage patterns, training opportunities. So lots of sharing from my workspace, lots and lots of data sets being published by the same author, etc. Suspicious usage, lots and lots of golden data. So one of the things that if you're not already doing so, you want to do is start retrieving all of the raw data from the Power BI activity log, and just store it, even if you're not ready to build a data model and analyze it. And this is a really good time to kind of put an asterisk on this. And when the second presentation starts, I will circle back and put a link in here for you. There is an item on the release plan that Power BI is going to make this data easier for you to access. Right now, the level of effort required from customers to get started with this is big. So this is one that's still really important, but we have things that are going to be changing here very soon. So I'll put that release plan link here in a little bit. And once you start having that data, there's a bunch of other kinds of data you can start marrying up to it as well. That really helps you figure out how are people using the system, and you can act accordingly. So here are the items that we went through in a bit of a whirlwind manner over the course of the last hour. We can use our last few minutes for Q&A. Before we do that, I will just point out that at the end of this deck, which, by the way, if you joined late, you can get the copy of this slide deck from my presentations page, which is at coatesds.com, or coatesdatastrategies.com is the long version. And then I've got a bunch of additional, links back here at the end as well, if you go and you grab this. So any other questions that we want to address before we turn it over to our next presenter?
Looks like we have one from Renaud. Regarding monitoring and the release plan you just mentioned, in your opinion, should we wait for Microsoft-made tools, the dedicated workspace with tenant metadata, or also developing our own is a must?
And that's a really tough question, because all we know right now is what's on that release plan page. And so here's what I'm worried about. It's going to come mid-year, and it's going to come in a preview. And when we are analyzing data like this, we like to do month over month, quarter over quarter, year over year. So I'm thinking that best case, it's coming mid-year, and we're only going to have a partial year's worth of data. If you don't have anything built yet, and you don't have any familiarity with PowerShell, that would make it a bigger effort for you to get starting to extract that data. So yeah, you might wait. If you've got somebody with time availability and a little PowerShell knowledge, and a willingness to kind of dig in and start building some things, I feel like I might start grabbing it anyways, because the history is only there for 60 days. So I know that's not a perfect answer, but I think we'll have more clarity on that soon.
Awesome, thank you. We do have another question that just came in. What do you think is a convenient way to start implementing the roadmap on our own as we go and learn, or find a partner who has done it before and can speed the journey?
Yeah, I think that depends on what your goals are. So I don't know of any partners yet that are specifically following this. I hope we'll start to get some, because it's still pretty young. But if you've got the funding, right, and you don't have the expertise in-house or the time, engaging with a partner is always a great thing to at least help you get started, even if you take the reins pretty soon. So I think it just kind of depends on how much you want to do yourself and how much time you have available.